I said, and my colleague said the same thing. We'll make sure the records go with you. And then she shook my hand and said, thank you, signed the agreement. There was a courtroom full of spectators. It was packed. The jury's ready. The media was there. This was a big kind of case that drew a lot of attention because her history was very sad. I interviewed a lady once. She was charged with murdering her. It was for an insanity defense. She was charged with murdering her 8-year-old daughter, and it was a horrible case where a lot of bite marks, stab wounds. This is before CSI, but it's like the worst kind of cases you'd see on CSI. And I spent 8 or 9 hours with her after reviewing her medical records. She was severely mentally ill. Other experts interviewed her, and I got her to talk about the crime and what was going on then, and then what she was feeling once she got treatment and realized the horror of what she had done. She actually developed a severe depression, which had to be treated. But what happened in that case that was absolutely mind-blowing for me was I didn't hear about the case. I sent my reports to the court, to the DA who had hired me, and to the defense attorney. And you don't know what's going to happen until they call you back. Will the defendant go off to a state hospital for a long time? Will they go to prison? Will they get a plea bargain? Will they go to trial? You don't know what's happening till it happens. So I was working in another forensic setting in a county jail in Fort Worth, and I get a call from the DA, we need you in court right now. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Normally I get a day or two notice. I got to cancel my appointments. And she goes, well, we're starting trial. I go, you couldn't let me know this like yesterday?
Yeah.
She goes, well, it all happened fast. So I said, give me 2 hours. I need to go home and put a suit on. So I show up and I said, why do you need me? Are you picking a jury, going to trial? She goes, the defendant won't sign the plea bargain to go to jail for 20 years, to prison, without talking to you. And I'm like, WTF, you know? I'm like, I'm the state's expert. There's a defense expert who's a colleague of mine who's excellent forensic psychiatrist. That's their expert who happened to work in the jail at the time.
Right.
Why can't they talk to him? And she goes, we don't know. The lawyer, I talked to her lawyer, she wants you. So I get there and I said, I want the DA there. I want the lawyer in the room. And I want the other defense expert in the room. And we're in a room half the size of this room, 8 by 10, all of us crowded in with the defendant. And I said, do I have permission to speak? And the defense attorney said, please proceed. So I asked the defendant, why did you ask for me here? And how can I and my colleagues help you? And she said, I'm scared. I said, I understand. I'm scared to sign the plea bargain. I said, you've discussed this with your attorney. You understand it. She goes, yeah, I'm scared. I said, what are you scared of? She goes, I'm afraid I won't get treatment and I'll get sick again, which is kind of a very powerful thing to say. And I said, talk to my colleague to work in the jail and explain, when you go from the jail to the Texas prison system, you go through an intake, which includes medical and mental health. Your records and medicines go with you. And there are actually psychiatric units within the prison system.
Are they any good?
Hospitals.
I mean, to be a little cynical.
They can get any medication that you could get in any outpatient clinic, for treatment of severe mental illness at the time. So in that sense, they're good. They are in a prison, but they can provide proper quality care and this lady had a psychotic illness.
How do you...
So I said, and my colleague said the same thing. We'll make sure the records go with you. And then she shook my hand and said, thank you, signed the agreement. There was a courtroom full of spectators. It was packed. The jury's ready. The media was there. This was a big kind of case that drew a lot of attention because her history was very sad. She was a nursing student with no prior mental health or criminal history who came home from nursing school one day and butchered her kid, basically. So, but what's interesting is that the interview, something about my spending 8 hours with her, in 2 sets of interviews, if I recall, led her to trust me. So interviews, you've interviewed Jim Lawler on this show, are all about empathy and trust.
Yes.
If you don't, and you'd think this person's evil, they're a psychopath, they're a sociopath, they're psychotic, but as a psychiatrist, we're trained to make that human connection with anybody. And that's kind of my motto in my work, forensic work and profiling work, where I've studied people who do horrible, evil things, leaders. It's nothing which is human is alien to me.
When you go into a room like that, like what I do here, the stakes are not the same. No one's, in a court case or in the middle of fighting for their life, or, in the middle of something where they killed someone or whatever it may be. Like, I'm just talking with all different people with all different opinions. Sometimes some are controversial, some aren't, but low stakes as far as I'm concerned. What you're talking about, though, is the highest stakes. You're talking about justice at the highest level, because we're talking about murderers here. And you're talking about people who have possibly, in many cases, committed those acts. And yet you have to go in there and find a way as a human being, regardless of your training and many years of, beating things into you, you're still a human being. Like, you have to go in there and you have to put aside any preconceived notions on this person or opinions about maybe the unspeakable things in some cases that they've done, and try to get a conclusion. And all the while, I would imagine, I've watched enough movies, and I would imagine this is pretty real, you're also going to run into a lot of people who are going to try to prove that they're insane, and you have to determine whether or not they're bullshitting. Like, number one, how do you put your preconceived notions aside? And number two, how do you even determine whether someone is actually mentally ill? Like, what's the process there?
I'll do the first question. With all human beings have biases, and in spite of one's training, we all have biases. Mm-hmm. But you have to put those aside and go in there with an open mind. Let me give an example. One time I was hired by the state in a capital case, and the defense let me interview the defendant, who was charged with capital murder, which is a very risky thing to do. I've had real top defense attorneys I work with said, I would never let someone with your skill set and talent be in the room with my client unless I thought it would help the client. But it has risk. This guy's charged with capital murder. He beat 2 people to death, for $200 of crack money. But I'd reviewed his records, and he had a lot of trauma. When he was in prison, he was beaten with a pipe. He had been a career criminal, had been in prison for other things, I think armed robbery and other violent crime, burglary, other things. And he was beaten till he was almost unconscious, and then raped.
Oh.
And I had the medical records of those incidents in the prison medical record, and his treatment and recovery. So we talked about that. And that's what, in a capital murder case, that's what you call mitigating data. Aggravating data is the dangerousness, the horror of the crime, the lack of remorse, other psychopathic character traits. Mitigating data is, if this person had these horrible things happen to them, does that somehow, will the jury look at that differently? So I put that in my report. And as a result, the defense didn't call me to, the state, did not call me to testify. And the guy, I helped cross-examine or write the questions and hand them to the DA to cross-examine the defense expert. And in most states, you need 12-0 to get
Right.
the death penalty. If you have one juror that says no, they go to prison for life. That's what happened in this case. So I got a call a couple months later from a defense lawyer, and it was a very famous, notorious set of murders where these escapees, around 2,000, escaped out of Texas prison, including, I think, 2 of them were in there for murder, and they killed a Irving police officer. And then were found in Colorado. They escaped, but they eventually caught them all. And I got calls on 3 of those cases for the defense. And I said, why did you call me? I've testified for the state, as you know. And he said, well, you were honest. I saw your testimony in that case where you evaluated the guy, and you were fair. And so that meant a lot to people.
It's the best compliment you could get.
Yeah, you got to be seen as fair.
Right.
Getting to getting to your other question, how do you, that's how do you kind of mix all this together? It's just very complicated. You have to put your biases aside, and you have to sort of manage your own emotions. And when you're interviewing a criminal in this system for a forensic evaluation, you have to really kind of get a sense of how to best interview the person. I had a case once, very challenging case, involving a young, first-time charged Mexican-American woman. She was actually an illegal. She was born in Mexico, but had spent most of her life on the Texas side. And she got involved in a smuggling case. It was a federal case. It was a very sad case. And the lawyer, who was a Latina from the border, called me up and said, I can't get past her defenses. I can't. I said, you speak Spanish? She goes, yeah, I'm a pure bilingual. I said, well, I speak Spanish, but the defendant spoke English. So we talked, and I couldn't get past her about how the crime happened and what the drivers were for her criminal behavior. And then I switched to Spanish, and I used the tu form, the informal form, and used softer words.
Instead of usted.
Yeah, tu, and, she was young, so I said, no, mija, por favor, dime algo. How did you come to this? And she spoke in Spanish and confessed to the crime. And I knew she wasn't crazy. It was a planned crime, but the drivers of it were traumatic things that had happened. She needed money, and she had lost a child.
She had lost a child.
Yeah, and she had guilt about that. So I put that in my report for federal sentencing guidelines. That's mitigating. And the lawyer, when she got the report, she goes, I'm blown away. But I had to shift in language to get her to tell me what happened. And once she told me what happened, we shifted back to English.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.